In our last lesson, we added in the lesson complete button, but then we uncovered a problem. By using viewState, we only keep the state around until we refresh the page. Now, obviously, this isn't going to work for our app. We want to be able to keep the state around much longer than that. So in this lesson, we'll look at how we can use the viewUse module for Nuxt and sync our state to local storage. So that way our state sticks around in the browser as long as we need it. We'll worry about syncing all of this state to a database in a future lesson. viewUse is an amazing project that comes with a whole host of composables. It also comes with a wonderful integration with Nuxt. And to install this, we need to install the module. I'm using pnpm, so I will use that to install, but use whatever tool that you are using for managing packages. We need to install the viewUse Nuxt package as well as the viewUse core package. Then, in order to use this module with our Nuxt app, we need to add it into our configuration. Now we're able to use the Tailwind module and the viewUse module. And time to start up our server again. Swapping out use state for use local storage is actually very simple. This is all we need to do in order to get our app to use local storage. The viewUse Nuxt module comes with auto imports built in. So all of the composables that you can use with viewUse will be automatically imported, just like any other composable or component in your Nuxt app. So now let's check to see that our app is actually syncing the state to local storage. We can do that by going over to the Application tab in our DevTools, going into local storage, and clicking on localhost. We can see that our progress state is already in here. And if we click around to toggle the state, this will update. And that's it. Our progress state is now synced to local storage. And if I refresh the page, we still have our state. But you maybe notice this weird jankiness. If I mark it as complete, it shows as true in the local storage here. But when I refresh the page, it first flashes as false. You see the mark as complete show up. And then now it's showing completed, but the background of this button is not green, it's gray. But it still shows true here. Now, what's going on? This is a little bit weird. This issue is because of hydration. Remember, when we first go to a Nuxt app, it first uses server-side rendering to serve up the app, and then loads in the app to run on the client side. Hydration is the process of going from a static HTML page served up by the server to a fully interactive JavaScript application. If you've initialized state on the server and then you want to load that state in the client, sometimes there are some interesting things that happen. So we need to pay a little bit more attention to how our state gets hydrated. In our app, we always initialize this progress state as an empty array. So every single time we refresh the page, it's an empty array. But then when the state is loaded on the client, it loads in the state from local storage. It does not use this default value anymore. And this causes a mismatch between the state that's on the server, which is an empty array, and the state that's on the client. So when we have a lesson that's completed on the client side, the server still thinks it's not completed. And so when we refresh, there's that weird mismatch. In the last lesson, we talked about useState, and now it has two benefits. Number one, that we can share data across multiple components. And number two, that it's better suited for server-side state compared to the built-in ref function. And this is one of the reasons why. Since we're not actually storing this state in the database on the back end, and we're just storing it on the client, we're not going to deal with solving it on the server. We're going to deal with it in a different way. Nuxt gives us a way to only render components on the client side, so that are not rendered on the server at all, using this client-only component. And since our state is only client-side right now, it makes sense to only render this checkbox button on the client side. Now when we refresh our page, we see that we don't get any of that jankiness. This is because the lesson complete button is only rendered on the client. It doesn't receive the incorrect state from the server. One of the downsides of using this client-only component is that we're not taking advantage of the performance benefits that server-side rendering give us. But because this is such a small part of the page, we don't really suffer any performance here. One last thing to keep in mind with this client-only component is that you should only use it when you have a component that sometimes is rendered on the server, but sometimes you don't want it to be rendered on the server. If, like we're doing here, you want this component to always be rendered client only, we actually have a better way of doing that in Nuxt. If we add the .client suffix to our component, then Nuxt will automatically render that component client only. We also have the added benefit that it's much more readable this way. Simply by looking at the file name, we can see this component is only meant to be rendered on the client. Before, we would have had no idea, and we could have incorrectly used that component in a way where it was rendered on the server. So just one thing to keep in mind. And because we renamed it, we'll have to restart our dev server in order for Nuxt to pick up that change. And as we can see, that jankiness is still gone because the lesson complete button is now client only, no matter where we use it in our app. So now we've got a pretty decent app going. It's got some pretty good functionality. We can look at different lessons. We can mark them as complete. That state is saved for us on the client. So the next step for us in our next lesson is to deploy that app using Netlify so that we can share it with our friends. We can use it as if it were a real app.